We're joined this morning from D.C. by Foley and Lardner partner and antitrust specialist Gregory Neppl. Prior to Foley, Neppl was an attorney with the antitrust division of the Department of Justice. So you know certainly what regulators are looking for when they're looking at cases like this. As Megan was just pointing out, and as we know, I mean, Randy Stevenson, of course, is going to argue that this is not anti-competitive, this deal with T-Mobile. So what is this hearing going to likely yield?
This hearing today will allow both the parties and deal opponents to set forth their basic arguments. The presentations will be very brief, so the idea that we're going to have any in-depth or substantive look at their positions is probably incorrect. And while the excitement is on Capitol Hill today, the real work will take place at DOJ and the FCC over the next year as those two agencies pursue their parallel investigations of the transaction.
Right. In other words, the real details, the devil is in the details and in the paperwork.
The devil is certainly in the details. DOJ will be digging into this transaction in depth to determine whether the transaction will tend substantially to lessen competition. The FCC will be looking at the transaction under a public interest test or standard. But those investigations will be very intense, very deep, and very expensive because both the parties and the deal opponents are spending tremendous amounts of resources on their lawyers, their economists, and their lobbyists to try to influence this regulatory review process.
Then what can the senators, what service then the senators, what can they provide today on this subcommittee?
Senate hearings like this are not uncommon. They typically occur soon after a transaction is announced. It's a useful exercise because it allows the senators to kick up the debate and allow the parties to make public statements in support of their transaction and the opponents to attack the transaction. In terms of actual impact, though, on the regulatory review process, in my experience, it's rather small.
Okay, a small impact. Nevertheless, you're going to have Randy Stevenson and you're going to have people from T-Mobile. You're going to have, on the other side, as Megan was saying, Nextel, all testifying. Who is going to have, in your view, I mean, I know it's early to say, but who is going to have a stronger argument?
The telecom sector has been under significant consolidation pressure for many years. We now have 4 national wireless providers. This transaction would reduce that to 3. We are thus at an antitrust tipping point with respect to antitrust enforcement, and DOJ is going to have to look at this transaction very hard. The important wild card here is probably Sprint. If Sprint is the number 3 player after this transaction closes, the question is whether Sprint will be a viable maverick and able to provide a competitive check on Verizon and AT&T, or whether Sprint will be a has-been and competitively neutered by the transaction. And the effect of the transaction on Sprint will probably have a very significant impact on how DOJ views the transaction overall.
All right, whether or not they'll let it pass then. Greg, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Greg Neppl of the law firm Foley and Lardner.